So you probably have heard that you need an estate plan. But what the heck even is an estate plan? We're breaking it all down today. You do not want to miss it. Welcome to episode 6 of the Emerging Wealth Podcast, a podcast dedicated to tax and financial education for high-income millennials. I'm your host, John Boyd, certified financial planner and founder and lead wealth advisor at Modern Wealth. That's modern spelled with no vowels, wealth. We're a fiduciary fee-only financial planning firm, and we specialize in tax and financial planning for millennials with elevated income. So estate planning is definitely something that has a lot of misconceptions, and it's definitely something that people just kick the can down the road, right? We don't want to talk about estate planning, partially because it's a morbid topic, right? I mean, it involves talking about what happens when you pass away, right? I mean, those are not easy conversations. And so we just simply neglect talking about it. It's one reason why 2 out of every 3 Americans doesn't have any sort of estate plan. There's also a lot of misconceptions about what an estate plan even is, right? A lot of folks tend to think that estate planning is something for ultra affluent individuals and that you don't need it. But after today's episode, you're going to know why everyone needs an estate plan and what even goes into an estate plan. Because I can promise you this, it's a lot more than just a simple will. So let's go ahead and dive in. So before we dive in, I want you guys to do me a little bit of a favor. So at Modern Wealth, we just launched a new kind of AI-driven retirement plan tool, right? So it's kind of neat. In the description of this episode, there is a link to an AI-driven retirement plan tool. This tool will project if you are on track for early retirement. How it works is you go ahead and click on the link and you're going to be taken to the tool itself. You're going to have a conversation with the AI driven tool. And at the very end, the results will generate a retirement plan. Again, it shouldn't take you very long, maybe a minute or 2 at most, maybe 5 minutes if you really, really think about all the answers. But again, it's really quick. It's easy. Once you submit the results, they get sent back to me. I will review them. And after a day or 2, I will send you the results because I just want to double check them. So again, really neat. Feel free to check it out because we're experimenting with the technology and hopefully you enjoy. So let's dig into it. What's an estate plan? So let's get this out the way. An estate plan is for everyone. Let me say that again. An estate plan is for everyone. If there's anything that you get out of today's episode, it's that you should have an estate plan. And I know that this podcast is general education. It's not specific legal advice, but I'm telling you this, you need an estate plan. Doesn't matter how you set one up, but you need one. Too many times, people think that estate planning is something for very affluent individuals, or you need to have a lot in assets or in your name, or that it needs to be complex. It does not. You just simply need to have one. Now, we'll talk about all the different components of a robust estate plan. But if you have done no estate planning, hopefully after this episode, you've started that process to set up an estate plan. So what is an estate plan? An estate plan allows you to direct and organize your assets during and after your life. Most people tend to think that it's after life, right? You're saying how you want your stuff in your house to go to your favorite niece or nephew, right? Whatever it may be. That's what oftentimes people think about an estate plan, but it's much more than that. An estate plan allows you to be in control of important financial and medical decisions during and after your life. right? This is an underrated element of an estate plan because, again, most people think that an estate plan is just very simply you directing where your stuff's going to go after life. And again, it is much more complex than that. And we're going to be talking about all the different pieces of an estate plan that allow you to make this a reality. Now, this could be a very long and complex episode, but we're going to talk about the different core pieces of an estate plan. We're going to talk about at the center of an estate plan, there's generally a will or a trust, and then there are satellite components of the estate plan around the will or trust that round out a robust estate plan. So before we talk about those different components, I just want you to visualize this. Okay, just imagine, right? You have set up, for example, a will for yourself. And we'll talk about what that is in a moment, but let's just pretend you set one up. At the heart of your estate plan, there is a will, if that is the case, right? You set up a will in your name. And then around it, right? The little pieces around your will that allow you to round out this estate plan. That's where you're going to have your beneficiary designations, your financial and medical powers of attorneys, a living will, right? These are medical directives, your guardians for your children, right? All these different components that go into an estate plan are circled around that will. At the center of your estate plan is that will, and then you have all those other key components around it to round out a robust estate plan, right? And a will, again, generally can be interchanged with a living trust, right? The living trust could be at the center of an estate plan, and then you have all those other components around it. But just think of it that way. So at the core of an estate plan is either a will or a trust. So let's start off with the one that you've probably heard about, a will. So a will is just very simply a legal document that expresses your wishes for your estate. Here's what's key though, right? Most people fundamentally understand that. But what people don't understand is that a will isn't active until after you pass away. Let me make that very clear. Will is not active until after you pass away. Now, once you pass away, the executor that you have selected will be in charge of administering the will. But until then, your will isn't active, right? You want to have one done, but it doesn't go into effect until after you pass away. Here's another thing that people don't understand with wills. Most people think that, let's say that you have selected your executor to be your sibling, for example, and you pass away and you tell your sibling that your will is on your bookshelf on the second row next to, some books that you have in there, right? That's where your will is. It's not as simple as your executor just simply taking your will, reading it, and then executing your wishes once you pass away. It doesn't work that way. Your will needs to be validated through probate court. So probate is a public process where a probate judge gets involved and validates that will. They'll work with your executor to make sure that this will is legitimate, that this certainly does express your wishes. Not a lot of people know that. Now, again, I want you to think about this for a second, because just saying it maybe doesn't seem very real, right? It's just, all right, those are the steps. But think about it for a second. You've passed away. Again, this is a tough thought, but think about it. You passed away. Imagine the trauma that is on everyone in your life. Imagine the people that would have to pick up the pieces after you've passed away, right? It's probably incredibly painful. It hurts. They're mourning the loss of you. And then to make matters potentially worse, your executor that you have selected is stuck picking up the pieces and potentially going through a lengthy probate court process to settle your estate, right? So they're mourning, they're hurt, but they're stuck dealing with the legalities and all the issues that have come from you passing away, right? That's tough. Imagine that. That'd be incredibly hard on whoever you have selected to go and administer your will. Now, I'm not saying this all to deter anyone from setting up a will, right? Wills can work fantastic for a lot of people. But generally speaking, this is why it's important to understand when it might make sense to do a will and why it might make sense to do a revocable living trust. So let's talk about a trust. So trust period, if you're not familiar with a trust is a legal entity. They come in all sorts of different flavors. They can be created during or after your life. Trusts can have many different purposes. They can be designed to protect assets. They can be designed simply to avoid probate. They can be designed to reduce taxes and more. For the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to be discussing a revocable living trust. This is probably the most common trust. And a revocable living trust, the main purpose of it is to avoid probate court, that scenario that we just discussed. Let's say you wanted to avoid it, right? I don't want to have my sibling or whoever I have selected to administer my estate, I don't want them to have to deal with that. So you set up a revocable living trust. So a revocable living trust is technically a legal entity. And this is a entity that is effectively going to own your estate, right? A lot of the assets in your estate, you're going to go ahead and put into the trust, right? So you could potentially put your home in the trust. You could put your brokerage accounts in the trust, right? And the idea is that when you potentially pass away, you would have a successor trustee step in and administer your estate according to the terms of that trust. No probate court gets involved, generally speaking. Again, it's a relatively smooth process. And from a taxation standpoint, this is a huge misconception. A lot of folks think that revocable living trusts have their own tax ID and separate tax returns, right? All that. None of that changes, right? Your tax situation remains exactly the same. Nothing changes. It's really just a mechanism to have more control of your estate after you pass away, have a smoother transition of that estate. But the trade-off is they can be more expensive to set up. So let's just recap for a second. We've discussed a will and a trust, right? These two items, a will and a trust, are generally what you put at the center of your estate plan. So you're probably thinking trusts are expensive, right? I mean, isn't this something that, super rich people set up? Not necessarily. If you simply want more control of your estate and want to avoid probate, then a revocable living trust could potentially be a way that you could solve that potential issue. If that isn't a huge priority, if your estate is relatively simple and you don't need the control, then maybe a will makes more sense, right? And a will can be very cost effective to set up. I mean, you could, in theory, set up your own will for, $10, $20 online potentially, right? I'm not recommending that, but you could, in theory, do it. So again, whatever one you pick, it's all going to be based on your needs. There is no right or wrong answer here. But the reality is, especially since this is a podcast for high income millennials and folks who perhaps are accumulating assets, you need to think about the logistics of what life would look like if you were to pass away. And sometimes probate court can be an issue, especially since probate court costs money. So again, not recommending either. This is just general education. But now you know the two main components of an estate plan, a will and a trust. Now, let's talk about some of the pieces that complement the will or trust, right? Because no matter which one you pick, that's just the center. That's just the core of the estate plan. You need to round it out, generally speaking. So let's talk about powers of attorney. So a power of attorney can be medical or financial. This is someone who's going to make financial and healthcare decisions on your behalf. They can go into effect during your life while you are fully present and coherent, or they could potentially go into effect if you were, for example, mentally incapacitated or in a coma, right? I mean, that sounds terrible, but they're there for those type of situations. Because again, imagine this, right? Imagine something happened to you. You're in a hospital. You can't make financial decisions on your own. And your loved ones need to get access to your bank account to make sure the lights stay on at home. Having a financial power of attorney in that situation is critical, right? And so oftentimes folks will opt to have their spouse immediately be a financial and medical power of attorney to make those decisions. And if their spouse can't do it, maybe they have a trusted friend or family member that could step in the event that a doctor declared that they were unable to do it on their own, for example. So again, you could see why this is really, really important. From a medical standpoint, again, if you were unable to do so on your own and doctors needed to work with you regarding end-of-life treatment, for example, and you couldn't make those decisions, well, medical power of attorney could potentially step in and help provide guidance to that area on your behalf. So again, this is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. And again, guys, I've seen this play out a lot where folks have not had a power of attorney set up and their loved one, something happens to them, and the spouse is left in a position where they're scrambling, trying to keep the lights on, pay the mortgage, and it's a pain. They don't know what to do because they were never formally given a power of attorney. So this is really, really important and a key component of one of those complementary pieces to the core of your estate plan. So to piggyback on the medical power of attorney, a medical power of attorney is often complemented with what is called a living will or advanced healthcare directives. Now, the living will or these healthcare directives are going to be very specific, right? They're going to be very granular, right? It's a little bit different than you just granting someone, medical power of attorney to make decisions on your behalf if you couldn't. This is you being very, very specific about how you would want those healthcare decisions made. So for example, if you were being kept artificially alive through a feeding tube and there was no chance of you being able to make a recovery, and you wanted to explicitly let your loved ones know and your medical power of attorney know that you do not want to be kept alive under those circumstances, a healthcare directive would provide those instructions. It would also provide instructions for what would happen after life, right? Do you want to be buried? Do you want to be cremated? Do you just want to simply leave that up to your heirs and loved ones to do that, right? I mean, you're going to write all that out in a living will or healthcare directives. One of the most infamous and sad stories regarding healthcare directives is the Terry Schiavo case. This took place in the late 90s, early 2000s. What happened was Terry Schiavo fell into cardiac arrest and was effectively brain dead. And there was a huge dispute between her husband and her parents. Her husband did not want to keep Terry alive. He felt as if Terry would not want to be kept alive under those conditions. Her parents disagreed and wanted to keep Terry alive. Now, I'm not picking sides here, but ultimately, Terry should have been the one to make that call. But unfortunately, Terry wasn't in the position to make that decision. And unfortunately, there was never any healthcare directives, no medical power of attorney, nothing. Nothing was set up to direct how those decisions would be made. What ended up happening was Terry was kept alive artificially through feeding tubes for the next, I believe it was 7 years. And a long legal battle drew out. It reached the Supreme Court, and eventually Terry's feeding tube was removed. I think it was around 7-8 years later. But again, this illustrates the importance of why healthcare directives and medical power of attorneys are so critical, right? Obviously, this is a awful and traumatic situation that we certainly hope doesn't happen to us, but we have to prepare accordingly. The next component of a estate plan is the beneficiaries that you choose. Now, I'm not talking about beneficiaries that you explicitly state in your will or trust, right? It's not you saying, I want, my house to go to my kids or and so forth, right? This isn't the same. What I'm talking about are beneficiary designations on your financial accounts. So for example, let's say you have a 401k. Have you indicated who you want that 401k to go to if you were to pass away, right? That's beneficiary designations right there. That's what I'm talking about. Not crazy complex, right? But most folks tend to neglect their beneficiary designations. And this is something that's really, really important because beneficiary designations, number one, it's relatively simple to do, but they also can override your instructions in your will or trust. So they're very easy to do, but you also understand that they come with a lot of power, right? Because you could have set up a will and you could have said in that will, I want my retirement account going to my niece, and on your IRA's beneficiary form that you filled out, you stated that it's actually going to go to your ex-spouse, right? If that were to happen, there's no recourse. That beneficiary designation supersedes what was in the will. So it's really, really important that you understand the ramifications of who you select as a beneficiary and on what assets. Certain assets, it might be more optimal and more effective to have beneficiary designations rather than simply having it pass through the will or even pass through a trust. So keep that in mind. We've talked about the core pieces of an estate plan, a will or a trust, generally speaking. We've talked about powers of attorney. We've talked about beneficiary designations. We've talked about living wills or advanced healthcare directives. Now let's talk about guardianship, right? This is a very underrated one. So if you plan on having kids, or if you already have kids, having an estate plan that states who is going to take care of your children or who's going to be the guardian of them is critical. Having an estate plan, going through that process of setting up a will or a trust, generally speaking, you are going to indicate who is going to be guardian of your children. So let's say you're married and both your parents on each side love your kids and would take care of them if something were to happen to you, right? Maybe a dispute would break out. Maybe there would be stress and friction because nothing was stated. By having an estate plan that establishes guardianship and states who is going to be guardian of your children or future children is absolutely critical. It's absolutely critical. And that is another key component of an estate plan. Again, guys, I hope you understand that having an estate plan is absolutely critical. It can start with something as simple as just simply making sure your beneficiary designations on your accounts are set up right? It could start with something as simple as that. But whatever you do after today's episode, I want you to think about your estate plan. And I know this is hard to think about. I know this is tough. This is not a fun conversation for a lot of people. You just don't casually, have a drink with your spouse and are putting your feet up, relaxing, and all of a sudden start talking about, hey, what happens to us if I die? Right? It's just not something you casually talk about. Usually this is something deep. It takes a lot of mental energy. And quite frankly, a lot of us, myself included, don't love having these conversations, but they're necessary. They're needed. So again, guys, I hope this gives you some clarity on what goes into a core estate plan, right? What goes into that core, a living trust or will, generally speaking, and then kind of the satellite pieces of the estate plan that complement that core, right? So again, guys, want to make it very clear that all of this is just general education. I'm not giving you legal advice on any of this. This is all just general education and knowledge, and hopefully this empowers you to optimize your own estate plan. I hope you found this helpful. If you have specific questions regarding your own estate planning or need some clarity, by all means, you can reach out to us at www.modernwealth.com. That's modern spelled with no vowels, wealth.com. Appreciate you being here, and I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day.